Would you be willing to die for your beliefs? Now, the man in this painting is about to do just that. This man is a Huguenot, a Protestant, in Paris, France, 1572. And on this day, Huguenots are being slaughtered by the thousands. Now, the woman in front of him is the love of his life, a Catholic woman. And she's begging him to put on this white armband to show that he's loyal to the cause, to keep him safe from the Catholic mob. Because all those who wore a white armband were agreeing with their beliefs. Now, this Huguenot, as much as he loves this woman in front of him, to him, to sacrifice his beliefs that he knows to be true beyond a shadow of a doubt, well, for him it's simple calculus. Eternal damnation for denying his God when he's tested in front of his fellow man. In Matthew 10:33, he's not going to get into heaven if he recants in his mind, right? To him, it's a simple calculus. Eternal damnation or a mortal life that sacrifices his beliefs. He looks at her lovingly, and as he hears the crowds, the mob of Catholic violence approaching, he chooses to let go, to undo the white armband and accept his fate. Now, on this day, St. Bartholomew's Day, there was another man who was also a Huguenot. Now, this Huguenot was a nobleman who was set to marry a Catholic princess. And this wedding was kind of one of the catalysts that erupted this growing tension between the Protestant Huguenots and the majority Catholic populace. So Henry, on the other hand, when he heard the mob coming, he chose to put on the white armband, and once trouble went away, he took it off. And a few years go by, and Henry of Navarre is set to become king of all of France. But before he takes the crown, much to the dismay of other Huguenots, he converts to Catholicism. And when asked why, how could he betray the cause or his beliefs, he said, "Paris is worth a mass." Now, you might think, oh, okay, this guy's just a traitor. He didn't care about the Huguenots. But when he took power, he ended up passing the Edict of Nantes, which ended up granting more freedom for the Huguenots to worship and also to hold civic office. He ended up doing more for the Huguenot cause than all the martyrs put together on St. Bartholomew's Day. And that begs the question, did the man in the painting need to die in order for these changes to come about? Or was it a better strategy to put on the white armband and then take power and institute more reforms than it could have done otherwise? Now, if Henry of Navarre would have refused to put on the white armband, like the man in the painting, I doubt the Huguenots would have been able to enjoy the amount of freedoms of worship that they ended up later receiving. Now, let's rewind the clock back a bit and go to ancient Greece. Now, a similar man who was also put on trial for his beliefs, and yet he refused the armband as well. Now, that man's name is Socrates. Now, Socrates, for those of you who don't know, was put on trial for impiety and corrupting the youth. Now, to give a bit of context to what happened for him to be facing the chopping block, right, was Athens and Sparta were at war. It was the Peloponnesian War. And Athens had lost, right? And Sparta put in their kind of like a modern day coup, right? They wanted to put in a government that was more favorable to their own interests. And these guys were called the Reign of the 30 Tyrants. And Plato's cousin actually was one of the main guys. And this guy was Socrates' student. And so they're in power, they're killing people, doing a bunch of horrible stuff for that year that they were in charge, right? And, this one of Socrates' students was one of the main tyrants, right? And he ends up asking Socrates to arrest this guy for some reason, and he refused. And they're, well, we're going to arrest him. He's like, go ahead. All right. So they didn't end up arresting him, but they're like, okay, whatever. And then once the old sort of guard came over and took power back for Athens, right? Like they were cleaning house, and they killed all the tyrants, and they were kind of figuring out what to do with Socrates, because yeah, he wasn't directly involved, and he did sort of show his uh, disloyalty to the old guard, but he still was very influential, and a few of his students were in that cohort. So it wasn't so much corrupting the youth as it was corrupting youth that went on to hold power, that took power from the other old guard, right? And also the disrespecting the gods. It was more of a political sort of trial. And people were kind of split 50-50 on whether or not they believed Socrates should be punished for what he'd done, right? I mean, he's a philosopher. He's someone who would always question people and make them look bad. And they ended up asking him, okay, so defend yourself, right? What's your apology, right? The book is called The Apology, but it's more translated to the defense, right? And what was Socrates' defense? He was like, well, I don't know what you're expecting me to say, kind of like the Social Network with Mark Zuckerberg, when he's like, oh, I should deserve some recognition from this board. Similar thing with Socrates. He was like, well, I think you guys should be thanking me, actually. I don't think I should be punished or found guilty. I mean, you guys, a fitting punishment would be you guys feed me for life, like you do the great Olympic champions, right? And obviously they were offended by this. He wasn't taking the trial seriously, because some of the students that he had, they literally were killing people, were very tyrannical. I think people kind of forget, like, there was some serious issues with what had happened, right? It would be kind of like putting a famous influencer or someone on charge whose direct student ended up doing something, right? I mean, it's just not good optics, let's just say that, right? Because people, the trial, right, it was a trial of his peers, but not unlike America, where you have 12 jurors. Back then it was like 500, right? So it was a lot of, all the Athenian citizens came to the, who were on jury duty, sorry. And so anyway, he gives this thing saying, I'm a gadfly, which is like a annoying livestock fly to annoy you guys, to wake you guys up to your stupor, right? So you should be thanking me, like what I've been doing. The gods wanted this, right? So obviously they were kind of like, well, this guy's kind of, arrogant, whatever, but well, they were like barely 50-50 split on whether or not he was guilty, right? But once he kind of came up with that, you guys should be worshiping me, blah, 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 blah. When it came to the punishment, yeah, they were pretty overwhelmingly in majority to kill the guy, to sentence him to death. Before they were like, oh, maybe banishment, whatever. But anyway, so he ends up going to his cell, right, awaiting execution. And Crito, one of his influential students who loved him, cared about him, was able to bribe his guards. And he's like, hey, he snuck into a cell. He's like, hey, let's go tonight before the morning comes. I don't want you to drink this hemlock and kill you. You don't need to die. Let's go. And in Crito, which is also the name of the book that talks about this, named after the student who wanted to save Socrates' life. And Socrates gives him a whole spiel about why he has to stay. Because to him, leaving now would be an outrage, because his whole life he'd spent in Athens, and he'd benefited from its laws and its customs and its justice system to be able to philosophize, to enjoy, somewhat intellectual freedom, right? And Crito's like, but this isn't fair what they're doing to you. Like, we should go. I mean, why not? You can keep philosophizing. But to him, I mean, Socrates at that point was 70 years old. He'd lived a long life. He kind of famously married the most disagreeable woman he could find, because he quoted saying, by all means marry. If you find a good wife, you'll be happy. If you marry a bad one, you'll become a philosopher. So, and it seemed like for him, he really valued his position in Athenian society. He obviously had some notoriety, and was pretty famous, pretty influential, had a lot of power, you could say, in terms of the shaping the intellectual life. And he reportedly said on top of that, of him enjoying the customs and laws he grew up with in Athens, and if he were to leave, he would be essentially betraying that and being a hypocrite. And he also was very concerned about how he would be perceived. He reportedly said that no one would take him seriously as a philosopher if he left when his feet got put to the fire, right? And the next day in the morning, he drank the hemlock surrounded by his friends and died. Now, one of the students in attendance of his death was Plato. And the only reason we know about Socrates' trial, about the life of Socrates, is because of Plato. Socrates never wrote anything down because he believed that writing something down would take away the living dialectic, the conversation that arrives at truth, right? Which is pretty cool. But at the same time, well, we wouldn't know anything about Socrates if it wasn't for Plato. And Plato, his cousin was one of the main tyrants, and his teacher just got executed. So he was kind of reading the writing on the wall, and he ended up leaving town and wandering around Europe for a few years. And eventually he came back, started the academy, and ended up teaching Aristotle. And he compiled all the works of Socrates and created his own philosophical inquiries. And he ended up teaching Aristotle, who obviously came up with incredible advancements in ethics, politics, biology, kind of the first real natural philosopher, the science, right? And 80 years after Socrates' trial, Athens put Aristotle on trial again for the same charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. And impiety means disrespecting the gods, right? And what did Aristotle do? Did he refuse the white armband and said, I deserve to die? No. He said, I will not let Athens sin twice against philosophy. And he dips. He goes to his mom's place and dies of a stomach ache a year later. Now, these two philosophers came to two very different conclusions about whether or not they need to die for their beliefs. Now, Socrates thought that if he didn't die for his beliefs, that it would be hypocritical of him to have enjoyed the laws that he abided by during his time in Athens in order to live the life he wanted to live. But at the same time, there was some worry about his own personal legacy, his own story. And one has to question whether or not Socrates really died for philosophy, or whether he died for Socrates, for his own story, for his own ego, to be remembered in a certain way. Now, Aristotle, on the other hand, he recognized the hypocrisy of the Athenian state that requires you to submit to them, same charges, same counsel, and he refused. Now, why? To him, his philosophy is, I don't need to die in order for my beliefs to be true. I don't need to put myself in the martyrdom noose in order to be vindicated for what I believe or for my beliefs to be true. They'll be true regardless. Now, history doesn't remember Aristotle as a coward or someone whose philosophy is tainted by any means. Socrates' hemlock is such a moving portraiture of someone willing to die for something they believe, which is, in his mind, the truth. In his mind, it's the unexamined life not being worth living. That's his life's work, his whole life's philosophy. And Aristotle thinks, well, you can still live the examined life, but it doesn't require your death in order for it to be true. Now, let's fast forward a bit, back to the 1500s. And during the Reformation movement, the church was obviously, the Catholic Church was obviously very freaked out about Martin Luther publishing his 95 Theses, the Gutenberg printing press that could now disseminate knowledge democratically. The Catholic Church no longer had the stranglehold on truth, because before then, right, to get knowledge, to transfer knowledge from one book to another book, it was all handwritten, and it took forever. And the only people who had these scrolls and could take the time were monks to do this. Everyone else had to work the farms and whatnot. So at this time, the church is experiencing threats to their power. Now, one man who was in the Dominican order monastery was a man named Giordano Bruno. Now, Giordano Bruno had beliefs that were very radical for his time. He believed in the pantheistic model of God, not a trinity of, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. They're all one entity. No, he believed in a pantheistic model where God is not in Jesus or the Spirit or, the Father. He's in everything, everywhere, all at once, which was pretty radical. I mean, the Lutherans, right? They weren't going that far. There was more about you only need the Scripture, right? Or faith, or by works, right? Like they were tired of seeing the indulgences of the church, paying kind of a fear-mongering preacher so your dead relatives can get out of purgatory, right? They didn't like that, and they were just like, you know what? We don't need like a hierarchical church and that kind of power structure in order to be saved, right? And the Calvinists also as well. So anyway, going back to Bruno, he's kind of having these strange ideas about God, right? In his little Dominican monastery. And they're like, you got to get out of here because there is an investigation, a little inquisition prelude coming on. So you might want to skip town. So he ends up leaving and going around Europe, telling people all about his crazy ideas about the universe and God, right? The universe in his mind. So at the time, the Copernican kind of scientific revolution happened where we are no longer the Earth, the fixed point of the universe. It's the sun is at the center and we're rotating around it, right? It's pretty radical. And Copernicus, he wrote we'll come back to him in a minute, but he wrote his sort of treatise in Latin. So it wasn't like meant for a general crowd. It was just meant for the intellectual elite. So it wasn't that threatening. But Giordano Bruno kind of runs with that idea. And he's like, oh yeah. Not only is the sun this at the center of the universe, but actually there's multiple planets and multiple stars and multiple suns and multiple universes. And, God is everywhere. So pretty radical. And he's pretty outspoken, gains a considerable influence wherever he goes. But he also gets excommunicated from, the Calvinists, the Lutherans, and the Catholic Church. So not one to be strategic when it comes to allies, Mr. Bruno. And when he finally comes back to Italy, ill-advisedly, he ends up getting scooped up. They put him in prison, and he's there for 7 years. For 7 years, the cardinal who was in charge of his inquisition was trying to get him to recant, right? And there was like 7 of them, or 7 to 9. And he was like, you got to say what you were saying was completely false. You got to put on the white armband, right? And Bruno, he's in prison for 7 years. He considers this, and he gets pretty close to actually recanting on half of the requested recantations. But at the last minute, he's like, you know what? I can't recant, because in his mind, his beliefs were so true. He felt it so deep in his heart. So deep was his conviction, and his belief system was so fixed that they were like, okay, have it your way. And they dragged him naked into one of the center squares of Rome, and they drove an iron spike through his tongue so he could no longer speak falsities. Now, 16 years later, a guy by the name of Galileo Galilei also gets faced with the same charges of heresy by the same cardinal who had put Bruno to death. And Galileo, for those of you who don't know, Galileo, a name you're probably familiar with, what he got in trouble for was he took that Copernicus, high intellectual Latin-based book, and he made a satirical book for the masses in Italian about the heliocentric model of the universe, that the sun is at the center and we move and rotate around it. The earth isn't fixed. Now, why was this such a big deal for the Catholic Church? Like, why did they care so much, right? Well, because it undermines their place in the telos, right? That everything is going towards something, right? That the earth is at the center and things fall to the center because that's where they want to be, right? They didn't know about gravity at that point. They thought everything was a perfect circles, that we are fixed, and it makes sense, right? And in their mind, because it models, well, we're at the center of the universe and the heavens, and God made everything for us, right? And if you're going to challenge that and say, well, actually, you're wrong. If we look at the planets, Galileo noticed that Jupiter has moons, right? So that rotates around them. And the math is actually better at predicting planetary motion when we put the sun at the center and the earth rotates around it. Because you have to understand, right? Like they weren't dumb, these people. Like the Aristotelian model that called, his name is Ptolemy, and they had their model of the solar system was the Earth was fixed and things would rotate around us. Okay, but if you ever look at the planets, the way they move in the sky, for like 80-90% of the time they go east to west. Look at Mars, it goes east to west, but then sometimes it'll like go backwards in the sky, and they're like, what the heck? Like, how do we account for that? It's called retrograde, right? It'll go backwards and then keep going. So in their mind, they came up with a simple system of the planets would do epicycles. So if the Earth is at the center, the other planets would go in circles around the circle, like epicycles, right? And so eventually, like, you're going to see it kind of like go backwards, right? So if we're fixed here, it's going to like go backwards a little bit, and then it's going to keep going, right? So anyway, and that model worked great. It worked really good for like 98% accuracy, but it wasn't 100% accurate, and they would be off by a few degrees. So that's when they started to change it up a bit. Copernicus put the sun at the center, but still had epicycles and still perfect circles. And then Kepler came along, and no longer was they circles, but they were ellipses, and it was more accurate. But anyway, that's a whole other rabbit hole. My point being, Galileo looked at the skies, he used experimental physics, created his own lenses, discovered that the moon has rough edges to it. It's not the perfect spherical celestial body. And he talks about this in this book. And in the book, he has a character named Simplico, right? Because it's sort of a conversation of the two models of the universe. And Simplico is kind of the Pope, right? That people could kind of read between the lines. He says, simpleton character. And he makes him look really bad. So obviously the church isn't going to like that. And so they put him on trial. And what does Galileo do? He bends the knee, puts on the white armband, and says, I recant. You're right. I guess, everything I said is a lie, But it's reported that right before he stood up, he muttered under his breath, Eppur se muove. And yet it moves. And yet it moves. No matter what you do, no matter what you say to me, it doesn't change the fact that the earth moves. And yet it moves. So for him, seeing what had happened to Bruno and recognizing, who cares what I have to put on the white armband? It doesn't matter, because it doesn't change the truth. It doesn't change my beliefs. It doesn't change the physical laws and structure of the universe. My death isn't required for my beliefs to be true. And they were proven true. And Bruno's beliefs, he had multiple, granted, he wasn't as mathematically sort of, or traditional physics oriented. For him, it was more spiritual, kind of mystic quality to him. But he ended up being true. He ended up being right. But one has to question, was it really necessary for him to die for his beliefs to be proven true later on? No. They were true, whether or not he chose the martyr's fate. Now, Bruno chose to die for his beliefs. A belief that, as much as he had conviction for, and he couldn't recant, because recanting would be recanting who he was, his entire framework, his entire life, who he was as a person. And to do that would be an irreparable break with his personhood. And to him, dying would have been easier than denying his entire worldview and his life. Now, after the trial, Galileo was sentenced to house arrest for the next 7 to 8 years before he died. And during those 8 years, he ended up writing some of the most prolific proto-Newtonian mechanics and physics that Newton later used to create his comprehensive model of the universe of classical Newtonian physics. Now, Rene Descartes saw what was happening with Galileo, and he actually had a book also affirming the heliocentric model of the universe called Le Monde. And when he saw what they were doing to Galileo, he was like, forget this, I'm putting this in a manuscript. And he abandoned his sort of external modeling of the universe and was like, okay, well, if I can't attack the external world, what can I attack? Is there other truths? Is there other beliefs that could be true? And he's like, okay, well, since we can't trust the way our model of the current universe as we understand it, we can't trust that, right? If the church was wrong about that, what else could they be wrong about? And he started to go a little bit inward, another layer. He's like, okay, what if our senses are deceiving us, right? Sometimes you look in the distance and you see like a mirage, right? And you get closer to it and you're like, oh, okay, there wasn't like water there. Or you see a friend that you think you know from the back, but as soon as they turn around, it's like, oh, I don't know that person. Or anytime you taste something and it's not what you think it is, our senses can deceive us, essentially. It's like, okay, well, I can't trust my senses. Or you think you hear something that's not there, right? Okay, thought I heard screaming, but no, it was just a coyote. It's like, okay, I can't trust my senses. Well, what about math? I could trust math, right? He's like, well, what if there was like a great deceiver, right? Like an ultimate demon who could literally put the idea of 2 + 2 = 4 into my head, and that's not what it is, but in my mind it is, because he's deceiving me. It's like, okay, let's go peel it back even further. What am I left with? It's like, well, I'm thinking. So if I'm thinking, there has to be a thinker, right? So I think, therefore I am. Mind blowing. Now, we might hear that today and be like, okay, that's a little ridiculous, of course, right? But at the time, it was such a dramatic catalyst for the Enlightenment, for the scientific revolution, right? Because we don't have to, he didn't want to attack the external world because that would be dangerous to question our place in the cosmos. That's the church's realm. Obviously, they just, were about to execute two, scientists, natural philosophers for that, right? So he's like, well, let's go inward. Let's go in the inward world. Maybe there could be multiple beliefs that could be true, right? And this one, well, this solid foundation of I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, right? And then I could build out from there. Now, something kind of interesting about this, just a quick aside, is, later philosophers would critique Descartes in the sense that, well, sometimes philosophy, what we claim to be metaphysical truth claims, are just kind of grammar structures that are casting a shadow, right? Because in Indo-European languages, we use copulas, a copula, which is a to be verb, right? I am, you are, we are, right? And in other languages, they don't use to be verbs. They just use kind of like Tarzan language, like me Tarzan, you Jane, right? Instead of I am Tarzan, right? So there's kind of this reflective impulse, but that's just kind of the language that we use, right? That gives us that kind of, I don't know, consideration or ontological questioning, the nature of being itself, right? And so, later scholars would say that it's not so much, I think, therefore I am. It's more so thinking is occurring right now. That's all we can be really certain of. And to assume that there's a subject before the predicate, right? That's kind of a leap, right? But I'll let you decide on that. I think both can be helpful, but also can be, drive you neurotic, I guess. But so anyway, why was this so transformative, right? Because now that we've denied everything, that we question our place in the universe, and we question our senses, we question math itself. Now from this kernel, right? This kernel of truth of, well, I think, therefore I am. That's all we can be certain of. Now everything else, we're gonna have to experiment, we're gonna have to question, we're gonna have to doubt. And Descartes ended up coming up with an incredible coordinate system, right? And reconciling geometry with algebra. right? Because before they couldn't find the slope of things as easily and create actual grids using algebra. So I mean, this guy was brilliant, right? So, but he was like, let's start inward, okay? Forget the external world because the external world is a little dangerous, right? So for him, he didn't die for his beliefs, which they were true at the time. Like, yeah, the heliocentric model was the truth. It was the one that won out in the end. But there was also other things that were just as true, which was the ontological uh, nature of being, right? The nature of being. And by him sort of pivoting and choosing to go inward with his truth and his beliefs, he ended up transforming a human thought and a human deduction, right? Without Descartes, we wouldn't have had the scientific revolution or the Enlightenment. And no one remembers him as a coward for not dying for his belief and publishing his manuscript that would have gotten him thrown in prison or worse. Now, one more example of a man who was also facing death for what he believed was a man named Fyodor Dostoevsky. Now, in Russia at that time, they had just finished the Napoleonic Wars, and after being encountered with ideas from the West, a lot of Russians wanted more reforms, more justice, more equality, because at that time it was serfdom, right? You're tied to the land, you're essentially a slave to the land, and you're just bought by aristocrats who marry each other, and that's like their only way of keeping wealth, right? Is owning people and lands. And Dostoevsky was part of this circle that would talk about these ideas that were coming out of the West that they got exposed to during the Napoleonic Wars, but also seeing the Napoleonic codes and ideas of democracy and freedom and revolution that were happening. And he's like, hey, like maybe we could do something like that here and change this kind of external power structure, because I don't believe this is good. I don't believe this is just. But obviously that was very illegal at the time, and Russia was very the Tsar Nicholas was very paranoid because there had just been an uprising of other officers after the Napoleonic War ended to sort of take the crown and institute change, and he clamped down hard on it and was very paranoid and making sure that other people couldn't threaten his power. And this book club that Dostoevsky was in, they would meet underground and kind of talk about these ideas. They talk about ideas of proto-socialism and utopianism, and they ended up getting found out. He ends up getting arrested, and he ends up getting sentenced to death. And as they line him up on a firing squad, as they make their way down the count, he ends up getting a reprieve at the last minute. And the Tsar commuted his sentence to 8 years in Siberia. And when he's in Siberia, obviously, I mean, this is like, in Fight Club, when you have a gun to your head, it makes you question your beliefs. It makes you question everything. And when he's, doing this hard time in Siberia, the only book that he was allowed access to was the New Testament, not the Old Testament, because there's, revolutions and uprisings. So the Tsar didn't allow any other books in the prisons except for the New Testament. And reading the New Testament, obviously Dostoevsky was very moved by sort of the metaphysical claims of grace and truth and forgiveness and charity and love. And he was someone who he believed before he went to Siberia that we need to fix the external world, we need to fix the society, and then flourishing will happen, right? But now that he's in hell, in where the dregs of society, the worst of the worst, he's being confronted with, well, there's people from all walks of life that come here. But just because, you're a serf or whatever doesn't mean that you're impervious or you're, a saintly creature who, once you get power and once you have a better lot in life, that you're going to achieve eudaimonia. Like he was very disillusioned by that, because he came from an upper crest of society. His father was a doctor, but wasn't like super wealthy, but definitely was also exposed to that world. And he thought, well, maybe there could be some reconciling here. He saw a lot of suffering with his dad's patients, and when he's in prison, he sees all this suffering and all these horrible people, but also really amazing people and all these good people. So in his mind, he reconciled, well, it's not so much about changing the external world as it is about changing who you are and your beliefs and what you believe to be true and your own heart and your own morals and love and forgiveness. And those virtues can be just as true as the ideas of achieving social reform, right? So after he leaves Siberia, he ends up writing in his books, his most famous ones, Brothers Karamazov, Crime and Punishment, about very similar themes to this, because to him, he was someone who was about to die for what he believed at that time, which was that in order for the world to be better, the external world had to change. We had to change the social structure. But after his time in prison, he completely went inward. And he said, actually, the most important thing you can do for your own life is to be a good person, to actually find love in your heart and kindness, and that the ends never justify the means, no matter how good you think the ends will be. If you have to kill and murder people and do horrible things that ended up actually happening in the Bolshevik Revolution, like many people died and were killed and horrible things happened. Now, I'm not saying that these serfs didn't experience repression and horrible things. I mean, we'll get into that in another video about whether violence can be justified, and I think that's a very interesting topic. But the point is that Dostoevsky was someone who could have got out of prison, went back to his beliefs, his old beliefs. But I genuinely think that he actually changed his beliefs. And our beliefs can be fluid, and multiple things can be true at once. It can be true that there needs to be social reform and work towards an external utopic ideal. But it's also true that morality can run through the heart of every man. Like whether you're just and good and can live a good life doesn't necessarily require an external change so much as it does an internal one. Because obviously we're not perfect, and we know that there's a lot of room to improve. Now, Dostoevsky put on the white armband, and so did Descartes and Galileo and Aristotle and Henry of Navarre. But can you really say that these men were cowards? Can you say that they betrayed their beliefs? Or that maybe beliefs are something that are fluid? Beliefs are something that can change when presented with new evidence. But at the time that the men in this painting and Socrates and Bruno were faced with the martyr's choice, they chose to take off the armband because to them, recanting or submitting would be a fate worse than death, because their belief system became fixed and immovable. I'm not saying what they believed was not true, because to them, it was the most true thing they could possibly imagine. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other things that could be just as true and just as powerful and not require your death in order for them to be true. So when we look back at this painting one more time, I want you to look at the woman who loved this man more than anything. And this woman was real. She was right in front of him, flesh and blood, and as far as we know, outside of some simulation theory, she was real. But the Huguenot, his belief system, what he believed to be true, we can say was wrong. He was wrong. And he died for a belief that was not only not true, but something that didn't even require his death, if it was. Now, I'm not saying dying for a belief can ever be moving or bring someone to tears of beauty and self-sacrifice. Now, obviously in this video, I didn't talk about other reasons someone could die. I focused mainly on beliefs, because beliefs can change, right? I think most of us would die for things that are real, someone that we love or care about, our family, our closest friends. But when it comes to a belief isn't flesh and blood. A belief is something that can change. Do you believe the same stuff you believed when you were 8 years old? Or 10 or 15, 20, 30? I mean, our beliefs constantly change. And for you to, what you believed just ask yourself what you believed 5 years ago. Would you be willing to die for it? If oh, I believe this, like this is so true, this is the truest thing, and then later on you look back and you're like, oof, I don't know about that one. So look, I'm not telling you what to believe or that it's never valid to die for your beliefs. But what I want you to think about, what I want you to question, really, I mean, hopefully you're never placed in this scenario, but if you ever are, you need to ask yourself, does my belief require my death in order for it to be true? And if so, you might want to really examine that belief. Because not only could it not be true, but multiple other things could be just as true and just as powerful and not require your death in order for it to be proven true. Now, if we look back at this painting, to me, the woman is the most tragic character of all because she sees him real, flesh and blood, right in front of her. And she wants him to live so they can go on and have a happy life and live happily ever after. But the Huguenot is so fixed in his belief system and so lost in the clouds of eternal damnation and salvation that he's blind to what's right in front of him. And he ends up dying for something that was proven to be not true, that was proven false. And he gave up the realest thing in this life, which is love and connection and enjoying the present moment in a virtuous, harmonious way. Yeah, but anyway, that painting made me really sad. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Now, if you enjoy questions like this and you want to approach life's hardest questions and the most difficult dilemmas we face as human beings, but you want to approach it in a way that doesn't appeal to dogma or superstition, that's what we're going to be doing here. That's what I want to do with you guys here. And I also, please don't take what I say as gospel. If you think I'm full of shit, please let me know. I want to have a flexible belief system, right? You don't want to have a fixed belief system because you could be blindsided by something you didn't even know. So let me know if you disagree in the comments. If you do believe that there's something that you would die for, there is a belief you would die for, that would be good. But yeah, just I want this to be a conversation. I want this to be an exchange of ideas. This is just my idea. This is just what I came up with. But I'm sure someone here has an even better idea. We're all ears. Please let us know in the comments. This is a conversation. It's not a pulpit. Okay? And yeah, well, I'll see you guys in the next one. Oh, look at that. The sun's out. Cool.